First at 9:30, we start with breaking news. The verdict is in for Sean Diddy Combs. Within the last 90 minutes, the judge adjourned court while he considers whether to free Combs on bail after his conviction on lesser charges. He was found guilty of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution, but was found not guilty on the 3 other charges, including racketeering, which would have carried a max sentence of life in prison. Thanks for joining us. I'm Corey Rose.
And I'm Jordan Chavez. We called in our 9 News legal expert, Whitney Traylor, to give more insight into the verdict this morning. Whitney, we appreciate your time.
Sure. Good to be here virtually, Corey and Jordan in Colorado.
How much time, Whitney, is Sean Combs facing?
Well, he's actually facing up to 20 years. It's 10 years on each count on the transportation to engage in prostitution, which is significant. And obviously we'll have the sentencing soon. But overall, this was a major victory, I think, ultimately for Sean Combs, because he was facing up to life on those racketeering and sex trafficking. That racketeering is a very serious charge. So the fact that he got a not guilty on that was really a major defense verdict.
Whitney, can those 2 charges that he was found guilty of, will those be concurrently or consecutively?
Now that I don't know in California. So no, he can face up to 20 years. So it's going to be each charge is going to be 10 years. So we're going to see the sentencing, and one of the big issues there is whether he's going to remain in custody. And I think the judge has asked for oral arguments on that at 1 o'clock Eastern. So we'll know more at that time. And she's asking for arguments from both sides at 1 o'clock.
What is the basis there? What does the judge consider when deciding if somebody is going to be released, waiting for that sentencing to happen?
Well, I think it's various issues related to his opportunity to stay in the country and that type of thing. So there's going to be, and it's interesting because these charges, the significant charges, I actually think he's going to, the judge is going to release him, but we'll know shortly.
So when they're considering how much time he will be in prison, what goes into that decision? Because max 20 years, but do they look at priors? What else are they looking at to see how much time he'll spend?
Right. There's going to be mitigating and aggravating factors. So that's going to be the argument is what was the extent of the charges, his history, what was testified at the evidence that came out at trial. And there was some really significant testimony that came out at trial, but obviously the jury didn't believe a lot of the testimony. I mean, there were over 40 witnesses, and a big part of it was this notion of coercion. Was it consensual? And I think that's where the prosecution really didn't secure the victory, because obviously the jury did not feel that it was not consensual.
Now, this was a criminal trial, Whitney, but we know it's not the end of his legal troubles. He is also being sued civilly. How does this verdict impact the pending and future civil trials?
Right. It's going to be relevant, but so where it's relevant is really in the testimony that came out, because you have to remember everybody testified under oath. So now they can use a lot of that testimony in the civil trial, and that will likely lead to settlement, because there's going to be a number, and there actually has already been civil lawsuits filed. And that really works in favor of the plaintiffs on the civil side, because on the criminal side, you obviously have to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, which the prosecution did on some of the charges, but not on the more serious charges. Whereas on the civil trial, it's going to just be a preponderance of the evidence, which is a much lower standard. And so what was testified to in this criminal trial can be used in the civil trial, because, again, people testified under oath. So he's going to face a number of different lawsuits. He could be found civilly liable, even though he was found not guilty on the criminal charges, because that different standard of proof. So we're going to, this is not the end of the trial. And of course, I would also suspect that he's going to appeal even these criminal charges because there were so many objections. This was a long, drawn-out trial. So there's going to be an appeal on the criminal front, and then we're going to see those civil trials going forward. And most likely, I would suspect they would settle, but if not, if he goes to trial again, I mean, these types of cases with the charges of prostitution and domestic violence and all these other things are really difficult on these survivors. And so whether they go to trial or not, we'll see. But I think he's going to be dealing with a lot of civil claims going forward.
I know, Whitney, the nation has really been fascinated by this trial. As you mentioned, it's been going on for about 2 months now. Talk a little bit about how the defense didn't call any witnesses and Combs didn't testify either. Do you think that made a difference here?
Well, so I think I'd separate that in two ways. The defense not calling any witnesses, they were still able to cross-examine. And in trial, my favorite parts of trial are cross-examination and closing. And because in cross-examination, you have a lot, you can really, a good lawyer is going to direct that witness where they want them to go. So even though they didn't call any witnesses, they were able to cross-examine all of the witnesses that were put forward. And remember, the defense, they just have to chip away because a reasonable doubt is a high standard. So they just have to plant a little doubt in the jury's mind, which apparently they did, and that was effective. Now, with respect to Diddy testifying himself, well, he's got a Fifth Amendment right not to incriminate. And a lot of people say, well, if he didn't do it or if these defendants didn't do it, they would get up and testify. But that's not how our system works. And there was a jury instruction to say, hey, if the defendant doesn't testify, you're not to infer or deduce any level of guilt or not guilt by that fact. That is their right, and you're not supposed to take that to mean anything. And so I'm not surprised that he didn't testify, because if he did, that would have opened the door to so many other things. And interestingly, the defense, they made a number of concessions, if you will. They actually said in their closing arguments, and by the way, these closing arguments, the prostitution went 5 hours, the defense went a little bit over 4 hours. So I've never seen closing arguments that extensive. But again, you have months of testimony. It's a lot for the jury to take in. But the defense came in and said, hey, if this was the case of domestic violence, he'd be guilty. They actually said there would be no trial. He would have pled guilty. So they didn't paint him as this saint. They just simply said, yes, they painted it as a swinger lifestyle, but they were very emphatic that everything was consensual. And they said, yeah, he had this domestic violence. They actually, I guess, conceded that, but they rightfully pointed out that's not what these charges are. That's not what he's being sued for here or charged with. And that was obviously effective. I know there was these 2 guilty charges, but again, overall, what he was facing, I think this was, he's got to be feeling really good right now about those options, even though he's facing serious time. I mean, up to 20 years. But overall, that was, considering he was facing life on the racketeering charges, he's got to be breathing easy right now.
Whitney, we do have one more question about a different group of people in this trial. Of course, you had a very high-profile trial playing out for the whole world to see. A lot of angry reactions from people coming in after some of these acquittals right there. What about the jurors in this situation? Is there any kind of protection for them, as they go out now and face the public?
Yeah, and that's going to be an issue. These jurors, and I don't believe they were sequestered, which was really interesting because there's so much publicity about this, and it's really difficult to simply ignore the news. But I really want to be emphatic about this. When people read a headline or learn a little bit about a trial here and there, that's fundamentally different than what actually goes on in the trial. What the jury looks at is the evidence that's presented. And so, we read a headline, we catch a little bit here or there, but there was 2 months of evidence. And, based on that evidence, that's what the jury reached its verdict on. And so now I did see, obviously the verdict just came down. I stepped out of physical therapy, so I haven't been able to get into the detail, but the judge did give some instruction to the jury about going forward. And a lot of time, and jurors are able to, talk to the public, talk to the lawyers after the trial. And that's actually really important for the lawyers. As a trial lawyer, I could tell you that some judges don't allow the lawyers to talk to the jurors after the case, but some judges do. And I think it's a real service to attorneys to hear what the jurors thought and why they ruled the way they did. So I suspect we'll hear from them, as a public. This has obviously been a high-profile case everybody's very interested in. But for the lawyers, particularly the prosecution, they can't. It's an opportunity to learn, and of course the defense in terms of what worked, what the jury thought, and of course the jury is. There's so much information that comes with the jury. It's a very technical and intimidating process, and so the jury is really looking for someone to trust. So they're implicitly going to trust the judge when the judge gives instruction and those types of things. But we as Americans, as a popular society, can be hesitant about lawyers and do we believe them? And that's where a good trial lawyer, I think, the most effective trial lawyers are the ones that are relatable, the ones that the jury can say, you know what, this person, I feel like this person is somewhat trustworthy, or they're, and on the converse, sometimes they say, this lawyer seems slimy. He seems like he's trying to get over. There's something implicit about it that I don't trust. And jurors can make their decisions based on the evidence, but that type of courtroom presence can have an effect for sure on jurors.
Well, Whitney, we appreciate you taking the time, calling in, answering our questions, because we had a lot of questions. I know a lot of people had questions, and I know that you were in physical therapy, so you didn't have a lot of time to debrief, but you really, really answered a lot of those questions. I'm sure we're going to be talking to you more about this. Thank you so much for calling in.